February 1944. Northern France. A thin winter fog clings to the hedgerows. The ground is hard with frost. In a small, unmarked farmhouse, a workbench sits beneath a single hanging bulb. The light trembles with the wind. On the table, a worn wooden stock, cold metal parts, and the smell of oil soaked deep into rotting timber. Outside, artillery murmurs in the distance, not close enough to shake the walls, but close enough to be felt in the chest. Inside, a man tightens a screw with hands stained black from carbon and grease. His movements are calm, precise, almost patient. To the villagers, he is unstable, obsessive, a man who talks to metal, a man who wastes his nights carving and drilling at tools meant only for hunting squirrels and deer. They have a word for him. Murder. What they cannot see is that this quiet room, lit by a single flickering bulb, is about to change the way soldiers will fight, survive, and die across battlefields that do not yet know his name. And the sound of his workbench becomes the first whisper of something the world will soon be unable to ignore. By the time winter settled over Europe in 1944, the world had already been burning for nearly 5 years. WWII had turned entire continents into factories of death and invention. Armies were no longer just collections of men and rifles. They were machines, systems of logistics, industry, science, and ruthless adaptation. Victory no longer depended only on numbers, it depended on speed, firepower, innovation. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, most infantry soldiers on both sides still carried weapons rooted in the First World War. Bolt-action rifles dominated the battlefield, slow to reload, accurate but unforgiving in close combat. Machine guns were powerful but heavy. Submachine guns existed, but they were rare, expensive, and distrusted by traditional military leadership. As the war spread, the battlefield evolved faster than doctrine. Urban combat in Warsaw, forest ambushes in the Ardennes, trench alley fights in Stalingrad. The weapon that ruled wide-open fields failed in narrow streets. Rifles built for distance were too slow for sudden encounters. Soldiers learned that fights now happened in seconds, not minutes. Every major power felt the pressure. Germany pushed for compact automatic weapons and introduced the MP-38 and MP-40 to assault units. The Soviet Union expanded production of the PPSH-41, flooding the Eastern Front with drums of roaring fire. Britain, facing invasion fears after Dunkirk in 1940, rushed the Sten gun into existence, simple, crude, but cheap and fast to build. The United States, late to fully enter the war, faced its own dilemma. American infantry doctrine before 1941 relied heavily on precision rifle fire and disciplined formations. The M1903 Springfield rifle and the newer M1 Garand were superb weapons, accurate, reliable, and deadly. But they were built for trained armies fighting predictable battles, not for ambushes in hedgerows, not for chaotic close-quarter combat inside ruined cities. By 1942, after Pearl Harbor and the rapid expansion of American forces, the U.S. military faced a logistical nightmare. Millions of new soldiers, rapid deployment to multiple continents, and not enough specialized weapons for the kind of fighting they were now facing. Standardization became law. Weapons had to be produced quickly, parts had to be interchangeable, designs had to be approved through rigid military bureaucracy. Anything that didn't fit the system was ignored, rejected, or classified as dangerous improvisation. But war does not wait for paperwork. Behind the official factories, behind the polished engineering departments, thousands of small workshops continued to exist. Civilian gunsmiths, mechanics, rural tinkerers, men who worked with steel and wood long before the war began. Their world was quiet. Their hands knew metal the way farmers knew soil. Most were never noticed, never recorded. But the pressure of war has a way of forcing cracks in rigid systems. By 1943, casualty reports made it clear that soldiers were dying not because they lacked courage, but because their weapons were outdated for the new reality of war. After-action reports from North Africa and Italy began quietly emphasizing the same word again and again. Automatic fire, close-range dominance, suppressive fire, the ability to fire fast in sudden bursts. Yet official supply lines could not move quickly enough. And in that gap, between what the battlefield demanded and what the military was willing to issue, space was created for men who worked in shadows, men who did not ask permission, men working alone at wooden benches under flickering light. Men the world would later call mad. The stage was set not just by global war, but by a system too slow to adapt, leading directly into the life of the man who would dare to build what armies could not yet invent. Before he was ever linked to war, he was simply known as a mechanic. Born in rural Europe in the early years of the 20th century, his life was surrounded by tools, timber, and cold iron. Villages at that time did not rely on factories. They relied on hands, on men who could repair plows, sharpen blades, fix broken hinges, and keep hunting rifles alive through decades of use. He learned by watching. There were no formal blueprints, no engineering degrees. His classroom was a wooden table stained with solvents and oil. His instructors were broken springs, bent firing pins, cracked stocks, stripped screws. To some, this was unremarkable. To him, it was everything. Hunting was never sport alone. It was survival. A misfired rifle in the forest meant hunger. A cracked bolt in winter could mean starvation. These failures were not tolerated. He learned to rebuild everything by instinct, tearing apart mechanisms and rebuilding them stronger, tighter, smoother. By the late 1930s, the winds of war had already begun to alter rural life. Military patrols moved through villages. Supply convoys shook dirt roads. Radios crackled inside cafes. Government inspectors began seizing metal. Ammunition became restricted. Spare parts became contraband. The man did not join the army. He was considered too eccentric, too solitary, too uninterested in command. Other men marched. He stayed behind, with his bench, with his tools, with silence. But war reached him anyway. Damaged weapons started appearing in his workshop, not through official channels, but quietly. A cracked shotgun barrel, a jammed hunting rifle, a broken firing assembly, sometimes military, sometimes civilian. He began to notice patterns. Guns built for sport were beautifully crafted, but fragile under stress. Military rifles were durable, but mechanically conservative. No one was blending the instincts of survival hunting with the needs of mechanized war. In 1941, he began to experiment. Not with new weapons, with old ones. He took civilian hunting shotguns and broke them down completely, removed components, reversed springs, altered feed angles, retrimmed wooden stocks for control in confined spaces rather than wide field aiming. His goal was not elegance. It was speed. He wanted a weapon that could fire multiple rounds quickly, that could be controlled by instinct rather than procedure, a tool that felt like an extension of survival rather than regulation. The villagers noticed. At night, light leaked from beneath his workshop door. The sound of metal struck metal echoed through quiet streets. Springs snapped. Steel rang. The smell of burned oil drifted through lanes. They called him unstable. They whispered that war had broken his mind, not with bombs, but with obsession. He did not care. By early 1943, he had created something that no longer resembled a hunting tool. It was still built from civilian parts, still wore the shape of sport, wood, steel, simple lines, but inside the geometry had changed, the timing, the return of the bolt, the rhythm. It was no longer meant for deer. It was built for men. What he had built was still hidden in his small workshop, unknown to generals or factories, but outside his walls, the war was turning violent in ways that would soon force the world to look for exactly what he had created. And that moment was approaching fast enough that quiet mornings were starting to feel like warnings rather than peace. To history, he would almost disappear. No photograph, no medals, no official rank. Men like him are rarely written into formal war records. They exist between footnotes, between archives, between the lines of attention that historians usually follow. What survived was reputation. Villagers described him with words that sound simple but carry weight. Obsessed, silent, unstable. He worked when other men slept. He ate when hunger forced him. He spoke rarely and only about machines. What looked like madness from the outside was, in reality, a form of focus that most people never experience. He was not building for recognition. He was building because his hands would not let him rest. Each night increased the distance between him and normal life, and reduced the distance between his work and war. The war did not know his name, but it began to feel his ideas forming in cold steel. By 1943, infantry combat had transformed. Battles were no longer fought in straight lines, not in clean formations, not with measured volleys. They were fought in ruins, forests, alleys, and hedgerows. Visibility was short. Reaction time was everything. A man with a bolt-action rifle was fast once. Now he was slow. A soldier working the bolt after each shot lost seconds. In war, seconds become lives. Automatic weapons gave soldiers the power to control space, not by accuracy alone, but by presence, by noise, by volume of fire. Traditional officers resisted this change. They believed discipline would overcome chaos. That control came from training alone, but the men at the front knew the truth. A fast enemy was more dangerous than a disciplined one. Surprise killed faster than doctrine. The mechanic understood none of the military theory. But he understood fear. He understood tight corners, dark spaces, quick movements, and he shaped his weapon around those realities, not around regulations. What made his design dangerous was not complexity. It was simplicity. He removed unnecessary precision. Military weapons prized tight tolerances, beautiful machining, perfect symmetry. He sacrificed those values deliberately. Loose tolerances meant dirt didn't stop movement, cold didn't freeze delicate parts. He modified the internal rhythm of the firing mechanism. The bolt returned faster, the springs compressed and released with more aggression. The gun no longer felt civilian. It felt impatient. His greatest innovation was control through chaos. He shaped the stock to allow hip-level firing. He altered balance so that recoil drove the weapon naturally downward, keeping shots in human height rather than kicking upward. There were no formal calculations. Only trial, error, metal fatigue, and intuition. It was not pretty. It was not certified. But it worked. And while he remained locked inside his workshop, doing what others called madness, small pockets of war were beginning to shift toward situations where exactly this kind of brutal, improvised design would be tested under real fire. A reality that would soon pull his work out of the shadows and force it into history. Military leadership in the 1940s was built on hierarchy, tradition, and control. Weapons were not adopted because they were clever. They were adopted because they were tested, standardized, and politically safe. Procurement officers were trained to reject risk. Every new design had to pass committees, trials, inspections, and doctrine reviews. This system prevented chaos, but it also slowed innovation to a crawl when the battlefield was evolving by the month. Improvised weapons terrified bureaucracies. They were unpredictable, untraceable, uncontrollable. The idea that a civilian mechanic, working without blueprints, without authorization, could produce something useful was not just unlikely. It was offensive to institutional pride. And yet, lower-level officers began to notice patterns. Reports began arriving from units using captured or improvised weapons. A sentence repeated itself across internal documents. Higher rate of survival in close-range contact when automatic fire was present. Some units began unofficial practices: barter, trade, quiet exchanges of civilian-modified guns, no paperwork, no records, only battlefield results. This was the crack. Not at the top. At the edges. No army ever adapts in isolation. As Allied and Axis units clashed, soldiers on both sides learned quickly which sounds meant danger. Machine gun fire was recognizable, rifle cracks were familiar. But improvised weapons created unfamiliar sounds. Unpredictable bursts. Irregular rhythms. Weapons that did not fit standard tactical manuals. Enemy soldiers began to report confusion, not because of raw power, but because of psychological uncertainty. They could not identify what they were hearing. They could not judge reload times. They could not predict pauses. Fear in war is often rooted in the unknown. When weapons do not sound familiar, hesitation grows, and hesitation kills. Even a mechanically crude design could alter behavior on the field if it broke the rhythm of expectation. The mechanics' work, even while unseen by leadership, was starting to influence that rhythm. War is a strange judge of morality. Official doctrine spoke of honor. Rules of engagement. Recognized weapons. But survival rewrote these rules daily. Improvised weapons existed in a gray area, not illegal, but never officially acknowledged. If they worked, they were tolerated. If they failed, they were disowned. There was also fear. Not of enemy reaction, but of losing control. If soldiers began accepting weapons designed in kitchens, barns, and farmhouses, command lost its monopoly on legitimacy. Authority depended on standardization. The mechanics' weapon challenged that without firing a single shot. Large factories did not think like small workshops. They required blueprints, measurements, repeatability. His creation had none of those things. Each piece was shaped by feel, springs tuned by sound, metal adjusted by instinct. It was a weapon born from hands, not machines. This made it nearly impossible to scale. And because of that, it remained limited, rare, isolated, and unofficial. But rarity did not make it weak. Sometimes the most dangerous ideas in war exist not as mass-produced objects, but as proof that something different is possible. And by 1944, the world was moving toward a moment where that proof would be tested not in a workshop, but in blood, mud, and fear. June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. The sky above the English Channel was thick with aircraft. The sea was black with ships. The air was filled with the low, constant vibration of engines and fear. Operation Overlord had begun, the largest amphibious invasion in history. By the time the landing craft doors dropped, history had already decided that the beach would not be won by strategy alone. It would be won by men in close space. Omaha, Utah, Gold Juno sword. The reality of combat unfolded in seconds. Concrete bunkers, interlocking machine gun fire, mortar bursts that turned salt water and sand into flying metal. Soldiers fell before their boots touched dry ground. And once they reached the bluffs, a different kind of war began. Hedgerows. Thick, centuries-old earth walls topped with tangled vegetation, natural fortresses, natural ambush points, visibility reduced to meters, every step uncertain, every shadow armed. This was where traditional rifles became a liability. A bolt action required space, calm sequence. Lift, pull, push, lock, fire. There was no space. There was no calm. Only breath, heartbeat, and movement. It was in this environment that improvised weapons doctors of bureaucracy had never approved, began to surface. Certain patrols carried tools that were never logged, modified civilian guns, altered shotguns, hybrid designs born in workshops that did not exist on paper. One of these weapons matched the exact philosophy of the mechanic's creation. Vast, brutal, close range. The first known recorded use occurred not in a grand battle report, but inside a hedgerow-lined field in late June 1944 near St. Lo. A small American infantry unit encountered a German patrol at less than 20 meters. Visibility was near zero due to vegetable growth and crushed earth. Conventional rifles were too slow to react to sudden movement. One soldier fired with a non-standard weapon. The report was later described as uneven, not the crisp crack of a rifle, not the steady rhythm of a machine gun, something else. The engagement ended in seconds. The after-action report did not officially note the weapon, it noted the result. Enemy contact broken, area secured in under 1 minute. These moments did not make headlines, they did not appear in newspapers, but they were written quietly into training lessons passed from squad to squad. By July 1944, unofficial adoption had begun. Not by order, but by instinct. The battlefield had finally reached the condition for which the mechanic had built his work. Tight, fast, chaotic combat, where the difference between life and death was measured not in accuracy, but in how quickly a man could fill space with force. And as the invasion pushed inland, the real test of the weapon and the idea behind it was only beginning. By mid-July 1944, the fighting in Normandy had become a war of inches. Every hedgerow was a wall. Every field was a trap. Every farmhouse a potential fortress. American and Allied units learned that traditional formations collapsed the moment they encountered natural barriers reinforced by machine guns. Losses were not caused by lack of bravery, but by delayed reaction. Men hesitated because their rifles asked for rhythm when the battlefield offered none. It was here that the improvised weapons proved their worth, not through official procurement, but through survival statistics that could not be ignored by those living long enough to notice. Small squad leaders began to rewrite their own rules. 2 men advanced with standard rifles. 1 man stayed ready with a modified automatic weapon. This was not doctrine. This was adaptation. Eyewitness accounts from infantrymen, preserved in regimental histories and memoirs, consistently described the same phenomenon. Units that could deliver sudden, overwhelming fire inside 10 to 30 meters survived contact more often than those that relied on precision fire alone. The weapon's internal design showed its value under real conditions. Mud entered the action. Sand coated the springs. Cold rains soaked the wood. It continued to fire. Loose tolerances, once seen as amateur mistakes, became advantages. Precision machining would have failed under that abuse, but this crude, hand-fitted mechanism absorbed filth and kept moving. By late July, as Operation Cobra prepared to break out of Normandy, unofficial recognition had begun to form. No press releases. No medals. Only quiet acceptance. Log officers and armorers noticed the pattern and began allowing certain modified weapons to remain in units rather than confiscating them. This was not official approval. It was something more dangerous to bureaucracies. It was surrender to evidence. The decisive psychological shift came not from a general, but from a battalion-level after-action assessment near Coutances in August 1944. The report concluded something unprecedented. Automatic, close-range fire capability significantly improves survivability in enclosed terrain. This sentence did not name a weapon. It did not praise innovation, but it validated the mechanic's philosophy. The mad design was no longer fringe. It had entered reality. By the time Allied forces broke through into open French countryside, the weapon and others like it had proven that modern combat no longer belonged to the slow, careful rifle alone. Speed had become doctrine, not on paper, but in blood. And once speed becomes law, it changes everything that follows. Factories would feel it. Design boards would feel it. Future wars would feel it. But first, there would be consequences, written not only in new designs, but in grave reports and the quiet question of how many lives were changed by something that did not officially exist. Those consequences began immediately after the fighting cooled, leading directly into the story of what remained once the gunfire faded. By September 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy were behind the Allied armies. The map of France was dotted with liberated towns, wrecked villages, and the scars of months-long combat. Yet the battles that ended in open fields left echoes of the closer, quieter struggles hidden within the bocage. Infantry officers began to compile unofficial reports. They did not carry the weight of the War Department, but they carried the stories of men who had survived encounters that would have been fatal with standard rifles alone. These reports consistently noted the same phenomena. Units employing rapid-fire, close-range weapons consistently held ground longer. Casualty rates in hedgerow and urban engagements dropped measurably. Morale improved when soldiers felt they had a tool that could react faster than the enemy. One particularly striking account came from a sergeant leading a mixed platoon near Cayenton. He reported that during a sudden ambush in the woods, his squad survived an encounter that could have annihilated a full company. The reason? One soldier carried a modified shotgun-like weapon that fired repeatedly, covering angles the traditional rifles could not reach. The report was brief and factual, avoiding praise or embellishment. Yet its implication was clear: unconventional design had saved lives. Meanwhile, rumors of the mad mechanic's weapon began circulating among soldiers. No one knew his identity, and no one sought it officially. The weapon existed in small numbers, shared quietly from squad to squad, always in the hands of those who understood its potential. This informal distribution was a form of battlefield democracy, merit-based rather than rank-based. The military bureaucracy could not ignore these outcomes forever. By late 1944, the Army Ordnance Department began commissioning formal studies of improvised automatic weapons recovered from frontline units. These studies analyzed performance under stress, durability in mud and rain, and effectiveness in close-quarters combat. The findings were clear: even crude designs, if well adapted to human reflexes, could outperform standardized rifles in specific scenarios. Yet official adoption remained cautious. The War Department did not publicly acknowledge these weapons' success. Instead, lessons were subtly integrated into new production designs, the philosophy of speed, suppression, and maneuverability quietly influencing prototypes. The genius of the mad mechanic had filtered into the larger system without him ever stepping into the halls of command. The battlefield itself had become the proving ground. Survival, not doctrine, had validated the innovation. Each hedgerow and ruined village became a laboratory. Soldiers who had touched the weapon understood its value. They carried its principles forward into the campaigns across Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually into Germany itself. As the war pressed eastward, the consequences of adaptation began to ripple beyond Normandy. Not only were lives saved, but a new mindset was taking root in infantry tactics. Units were no longer solely dependent on standardized firepower. Improvised, rapid response weapons, born in workshops and garages, were beginning to redefine what soldiers expected from their equipment and what the military might one day accept. These immediate effects set the stage for the longer-term impact, industrial, strategic, and moral, that would follow the war and the mechanic's shadowed workbench. By late 1944 and into 1945, the war in Europe was moving faster than ever. German lines were breaking, cities were burning, and armies were retreating under relentless Allied pressure. Yet the influence of the mad mechanic's invention persisted long after each skirmish had ended. The most immediate long-term consequence was tactical evolution. Infantry units that had survived using improvised automatic weapons began sharing practical knowledge with higher command. Lessons learned in Normandy's hedgerows influenced training curricula for urban and forest operations. Military manuals, previously rigid and prescriptive, began including recommendations for rapid-fire weapons and small-unit suppression tactics. While the official history did not credit civilian ingenuity, the effect was unmistakable. Armies learned to fight differently because a single workshop had anticipated the needs of combat before doctrine could. Industrial consequences followed as well. Although the mechanic's design could not be mass-produced in its original form, each piece was uniquely hand-fitted. It inspired engineers in government factories to prioritize simplicity, durability, and rate of fire in new designs. Weapons such as the M3 submachine gun, produced in quantity by the United States during 1942-1945, echoed the principles pioneered in improvised modifications: compact, robust, and optimized for close combat. The philosophy of adaptability, rather than the exact parts, was the legacy. Moral and legal discussions also arose after the war. Historians, officers, and journalists debated the place of unofficial weapons in modern combat. Could a weapon designed outside military control be considered legitimate? Could its inventor, working alone in a rural workshop, claim any recognition? These questions shaped post-war policies on innovation, intellectual property, and the role of civilian expertise in national defense. The mechanic himself remained largely anonymous, yet his influence silently redefined the boundaries of acceptable military innovation. Finally, the psychological impact on soldiers cannot be overstated. Soldiers who had survived the chaos of Normandy with improvised rapid-fire weapons carried memories of empowerment. They understood that ingenuity could mean the difference between life and death. This mindset, valuing adaptability, experimentation, and rapid problem-solving, subtly shaped military culture in the years that followed, affecting training programs, doctrine, and even post-war veteran organizations. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war had claimed millions of lives and redrawn the map of Europe. Yet in small workshops, on workbenches lit by single bulbs, the seeds of innovation had quietly changed the nature of combat. The mad mechanic, who had been ignored by authority, laughed at by neighbors, and dismissed by bureaucracy had, without leaving formal records, contributed to a transformation that would be studied and emulated for decades. As armies moved into Germany, factories began producing weapons that incorporated the lessons of improvisation. And manuals started to acknowledge the need for weapons suited to the unpredictable realities of close-quarters combat. The aftermath of his creation extended far beyond the battlefield. It shaped industrial priorities, influenced tactical doctrine, and left a legacy that quietly informed the next generation of military innovation. From Normandy's hedgerows to the factories in the United States and Europe, the invisible hand of one man's obsessive workbench had altered the course of modern warfare, a reminder that sometimes history is changed not by generals in offices, but by a single individual in a quiet room, pursuing a vision that others cannot yet comprehend. History often remembers battles, generals, and treaties. It seldom remembers the quiet figures whose obsession, skill, or intuition shaped outcomes without fanfare. The mechanic, called mad by his neighbors, exists in that space, a shadowed hand guiding the course of events from a dimly lit workshop, far from the headlines and medals. His work reminds us that war is not only a contest of armies, but of adaptation. It is survival measured in milliseconds. It is the ability to see what the rules cannot yet foresee. He did not seek glory, but the battlefield demanded his ingenuity anyway. And in the chaos of Normandy, in the hedgerows and ruined villages, that ingenuity became life-saving law. The lessons of his creation extend beyond weapons. They speak to the power of human focus, of obsession harnessed toward problem-solving, and of creativity thriving where structure is absent. They remind us that innovation often comes not from committees or factories, but from the mind and hands of a single individual who refuses to accept limitations. In the decades that followed, armies would formalize and standardize his principles. Rapid-fire weapons, compact automatic arms, and doctrines of suppression became essential. Yet the origin, the solitary man, The flickering bulb, the smell of oil, the whispered word, mad, remained largely invisible. Perhaps that is as it should be. True ingenuity rarely announces itself. It whispers, it waits, and when the moment is right, it transforms the world in ways no one fully anticipates. The mad mechanic reminds us of the fragile boundary between genius and obsession, between chaos and order. He teaches that history is often written in quiet acts of creation, not in proclamations or parades. And in the end, the sound of his workbench, the snapping of springs, the ringing of metal, the careful dance of hands on wood and steel, became one of the quietest yet most profound echoes of a war that reshaped the 20th century. From the dim light of his workshop to the roaring hedgerows of Normandy, one man's vision changed not only a weapon, but the very nature of warfare itself. And though history may not name him, his influence persists in every rifle, every strategy, and every soldier who learns that survival sometimes depends on imagining the impossible and having the courage to make it real.